Okay, so this is a new video on cell size. It's been quite a few years since I made a video on cell size, and since College Board has updated the curriculum in 2025-2026, I thought it was time for a new one. Now, I do want to make a disclaimer. This video is a little different than my others. In this one, I'm going to ask you to think and make predictions along the way. So feel free to hit pause and actually process and get the most out of this video. Oops, sorry. So before we begin though, there are two words that we're going to use a lot, and they are volume and surface area. So to make an analogy or a comparison, we have the skin of an apple would be the surface area, while the inside would be the volume. So let's go ahead and begin. So we want to think first though, like, why does the surface of a cell matter? Like, what is happening at the surface of a cell, right? Now this is the beginning of Unit 2, so we have not got into transport yet, but this is where molecules are going to enter and leave a cell through the cell membrane along the surface of the cell. And so there's a lot of exchange of matter with the environment, and then the inside molecules inside the cell can leave a cell or enter a cell, and that's all occurring at its surface. So the surface area compared to the volume of a cell does matter depending on what its function is. So we have passive and active transport are used or occur at the surface of cells. Now if we look at different types of cells, here we have some fat cells, adipose cells, and some muscle cells. Now if you think about the shape of these two cells, they're very different. Right? Fat cells kind of have unlimited storage capacity. As you gain weight, your fat cells can just store more and more and more triglycerides for you. Whereas your muscle cells are going to be long and slender, right? Used for motion and movement. So if we think about their surface area and their volume, we can see how the fat cells are going to have a whole lot more volume in comparison to the surface area, whereas the muscle cells have a lot more surface area in comparison to the volume. Now, that relates to their functions. When we think about fat cells, adipose cells, are storing triglycerides. There's not a lot of metabolic activity occurring within a fat cell. It's really going to be primarily used for storage, right? Now, if you think about muscle cells have a whole lot of aerobic and anaerobic respiration occurring. So lots of ATP, which means we're going to need lots of oxygen. Carbon dioxide is going to be exchanged. We're going to have glucose being entered, ATP being produced. So a lot is happening across that surface area of muscle fibers. So their shapes do relate to their functions, and we can tie in their amount of surface area compared to the volume also relates to their overall functioning of these cells. So let's go ahead and have a few more thought-provoking questions. What about a small intestine, right? When we eat food, what is the function of the small intestine? That's going to be to absorb our nutrients. If I have some almond milk, for example, there's lots of calcium in almond milk. That's an opportunity for that calcium to be absorbed into my body when it's in my small intestines. And so when we think about the cells lining the intestines, right, predict the shape of intestinal cells based on their function. If we need lots of absorption and diffusion of molecules and nutrients entering into our body, the amount of surface area is going to matter. So we need a lot of surface area for that absorption and diffusion of nutrients from our food into our bodies. So we think about what would be a good shape for that, right? It's going to be something with a high surface area. And the cells lining our intestines have lots of little finger-like projections. These finger-like projections are going to increase the amount of surface area for absorption of those nutrients, whether it's by diffusion or active transport or facilitated diffusion. If you think about my fingers, for example, if I were to measure the amount of this surface area, if that was the only area where molecules could diffuse into my cells, versus if I go like this, oh my gosh, there's so much more surface area. So folds or projections in cells have often evolved to maximize surface area for a given amount of volume. Now, when we look at this here, so why is having a large surface area compared to volume important? It maximizes the amount of lipid bilayer available for exchange of nutrients with the environment. And the intestines is a perfect example of that. Now, if you were to look at 3 different types of cells, the one here on the right, cell C, has an enormous amount of surface area compared to the volume, which is perfect for diffusion and absorptions of nutrients in the small intestine. Whereas cell A over here is going to be perfect for like fat storage, right? There's less surface area compared to the volume, so that's going to be a good like storage cell. Now, when we look at, let's take these two blocks and let's assume they are the same volume. Right? What would be the advantage of having okay, let's look about it. If figure 1 represents a very large cell, and then figure 2 represents the same amount of volume, but divided into a whole bunch of smaller cells. Like, what is the advantage of that? Like, why are we as large humans made of trillions of tiny cells? Why not just a couple big cells, right? So when we break into smaller cells, if these 2 figures have the same amount of volume, we can see how the surface area is so much greater when we have smaller cells. And so when we look at this surface area, as we get smaller, the surface area increases compared or relatively speaking to the volume. Now, why would this be an advantage for multicellular organisms? Well, if you think about it, our cells have needs, right? They have not desires, but they need oxygen, they need amino acids, they need glucose, they need all ions, right? They have all these needs to function optimally, and they also produce wastes, and so the waste can diffuse out. So being multicellular allows for like a more efficient exchange of nutrients between cells and their environments. Now we can look at this mathematically as well. So here I see 3 different examples. I have a small, like single cell, and then a large one. Let's just look at the first 2 columns. Now, the way we find the surface area to volume ratio is you're going to find and calculate the surface area, and then you're going to divide it by the volume. So here, if we look at just these 2, we see the smaller cube has a surface area to volume ratio of 6, whereas the larger cube has a surface area to volume ratio of 1.2. So how do they compare? Well, the smaller cube has a larger surface area to volume ratio compared to the large cube in the center there. So in terms of efficiency, with which materials cross the membrane, how does what does a high or low surface area to volume ratio mean? When you calculate a larger surface area to volume ratio, it means it's more efficient. There's more surface area in compared to the volume, and therefore it's going to be like let's just take simple diffusion, for example. It's going to be more efficient at diffusion and exchanging those nutrients, where a lower surface area to volume ratio, like we see in that large cube, is going to be more appropriate, kind of like those fat cells at the beginning of the video. They have so much more volume in comparison to the surface area that it'll be ideal for storage and doesn't have high demand or high need for a lot of materials entering into that cell. Now, for College Board, if you're taking this class for AP Bio, there is a series of formulas, and so College Board will give you this, and there's different shapes, and you can, as long as you can calculate the surface area and the volume, you can find the ratio of surface area to volume. Sometimes they'll give it to you, and all you have to do is divide. And so here's an example. If I have surface area and volume for each of these 3 cubes, if I calculate them, here I have 6, 3, and 2. But knowing what to do with those numbers or what those numbers mean matters. So if I were to ask which cell would be the most efficient at exchanging nutrients with the environment, well, that's going to be cell number 1. It has the highest surface area to volume ratio. If I were to ask you which is the least efficient, well, then you're going to pick cell 3, right? It has more volume in comparison to its surface area. So when we look at cells and they're all the different shapes, we have over 200 different kinds of cells in our body, and their shape reflects their function. And so if I look at like a red blood cell, for example, that concave shape of a red blood cell, kind of like a frisbee, right? It's not like a ball or a sphere, but it's been flattened. So we have a greater surface area compared to the volume, which makes perfect sense for the function of red blood cells. We have oxygen when we breathe in, is going to then diffuse into our blood cells, and then our blood cells will transport that throughout our body. So a cell that has like high diffusion rates would make sense to have a high surface area to volume ratio. Okay, one of my favorite examples of this are actually root hairs. If you've ever germinated seeds and you see little tiny hairs coming off the roots, that's like you took a cell on the root of a plant and you like stretched out its cytoplasm. Or if you take like a balloon and you stretch a balloon, is really what those root hairs are. They're like extensions. So here you have this like cytoplasm being stretched out on a root hair that's maximizing and totally increasing the surface area in comparison to the volume, which is perfect for a growing plant that's going to need a lot of nutrients from the soil, as well as like water absorption. And so the shape totally matches its function. I also love the way the internal structures of our lungs have evolved. If you think about our lungs, there's a lot of gas exchange occurring there. So as I breathe in oxygen, like this, we have oxygen going down our trachea, into our bronchioles, and into our alveoli, where then it's going to diffuse into our blood. It would make sense that the inside of our lungs breaks into a lot of tiny, stretched out projections to maximize the surface area for a given volume in our rib cage, making it more efficient at exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide with our circulatory system. Now, not all organisms have internal lungs, right? So this axolotl here is in a very low oxygen environment, right? Lives in like waters where there's not a lot of, the word is dissolved oxygen. There's not a lot of dissolved oxygen. So it has evolved gills on the outside to then, if you can think about how it increases the surface area compared to the volume to maximize the diffusion of oxygen that's low in the environment into its circulatory system. Okay, and then we're kind of going to switch gears now into the shapes of organisms. So far we've been talking about cells, and now we're moving into like body shapes. So if we look at these two rabbits, we can see the desert hare and the Arctic hare. Now their body shapes are very different. The Arctic hare, the snow rabbit, the snowshoe hare, is very round, like a ball, kind of like that fat cell from the beginning of our lesson, right? So it has this really like round shape that has a high volume and a smaller amount of surface area compared to the volume. So if you did surface area divided by volume, you'd have a lower number than doing the same thing with the desert rabbit. If you look at that desert rabbit's ears, for example, so the desert hare is going to live in a hot environment, and so those large flat ears have evolved to maximize surface area for evaporative cooling. So that's going to be a mechanism for that rabbit to have heat escape. So as the wind comes by, hopefully it'll take some of the heat. Or its long, skinny legs. That's a lot of surface area compared to the volume. This rabbit can actually lick its legs to create, because they don't sweat. Just humans and horses sweat. And so if it licks its legs and gets it wet, as the wind comes by, it can take some of the heat. So its body shape has evolved to maximize surface area for heat loss to the environment, compared to the Arctic hare has evolved a shape with a lower surface area to volume ratio to contain its heat, because it's a warm-blooded endotherm in the Arctic. It's evolved to prevent heat loss to the environment and have a very low surface area to volume ratio. Okay, now we can also look at this with giraffes and walruses, right? So you have like a giraffe living in the savannah, the Serengeti, with a hot environment. You have this long neck that maximizes surface area compared to volume for evaporative cooling. Or at the same time, losing more heat to its environment, compared to the walrus living in a very cold environment and being a warm-blooded endothermic animal, has evolved to have insulation and lipids and conserve its heat. So its volume is larger compared to its surface area, which then kind of prevents how much of its body is interacting with that cold environment. Okay. And then our last slide is last topic is we're going to talk about the metabolic rate. One of my favorite topics in biology is how we thermoregulate and how we maintain a warm, constant body temperature. So as humans, we're 98.6 degrees, right? So our heat is generated by our mitochondria. So when we use our mitochondria, we make more heat. For example, I'm a cross-country coach, and when I run, I get real hot and red, and my body's generating heat. I start to sweat to cool off to keep me at homeostasis. Now, We do lose heat to our environment. If I go into the snow without a beanie and without a jacket, I'm going to be losing a lot of body heat to the environment, and my muscles are going to shiver because my mitochondria are trying to, well, the mitochondria are being used to create the shivering, and then the shivering creates friction. Two ways my body is trying to generate heat as I lose it to my environment. So if we look at these two animals, here we have a little tiny shrew and we have an elephant, right? So if we take their surface area divided by their volume, the little tiny rodent is going to have a higher surface area to volume ratio. And then the elephant is going to have a lower surface area to volume ratio. So as both of these warm-blooded mammals generate heat with their mitochondria, the shrew has more surface area in comparison to its volume, where it's going to have heat loss to its environment, which means its mitochondria are going to have to work harder to generate the heat that's being lost to the environment, and therefore it's going to have a higher metabolic rate. If you look at the metabolic rate between these two organisms, the smaller the species, the smaller the organism, the higher the metabolic rate, because it needs to generate more heat to make up for the heat that's lost to the environment due to their large surface area compared to volume ratios, compared to the elephant, who has lots of mass and a lot of volume. And so when you take its surface area divided by its volume, it has less heat loss to the environment in comparison to the little rodent. Woo! So hopefully that all makes sense for you and you're able to visualize and follow along. And so great job on cell size, and yeah, good job.